The easiest way to spot someone who does not understand property rights is to watch how confidently they walk toward your gate. That thought crossed my mind the exact second I heard tires crunch across the gravel road leading to my land. The morning had begun exactly the way I liked it. A cool breeze drifted across the small lake beyond my pasture, carrying the scent of fresh pine and damp earth while the first rays of sunlight painted the weathered fence in soft shades of gold. I stood beside the old wooden gate with a hammer in one hand, replacing a loose fence board that winter storms had finally worn down after years of faithful service. Hanging from my belt was the old brass gate key my grandfather carried long before I inherited this property. Beside my pickup truck rested a weathered survey tube that contained original county maps and surveys I had not opened in years. I had no reason to. The boundaries of my family's land had never changed. The quiet morning disappeared beneath the sound of 3 sport utility vehicles rolling toward the entrance. Dust floated through the air as they stopped just outside the closed gate. Before the engines were fully silent, a woman stepped confidently from the lead vehicle, carrying a thick yellow folder beneath one arm. She wore an immaculate white sweater, dark navy slacks, and the expression of someone completely certain she was about to solve a problem. Behind her, several members of the Homeowners Association board climbed from the other vehicles holding clipboards, cameras, and measuring tapes. They walked toward the entrance without hesitation, as though they had repeated this routine dozens of times before. The woman stopped only a few feet from the gate and looked directly at me. "Good morning," she said with practiced confidence. "I am Susan Walker, president of the Homeowners Association. We are here to inspect this property. Please unlock the gate." I rested both hands on the top rail of the fence and looked at the group standing outside my entrance. The only sounds were birds calling from the trees and gentle waves touching the shoreline behind me. "No," I answered calmly. The single word seemed to confuse her more than if I had started arguing. She blinked once before opening the yellow folder. "Excuse me?" she asked. "You heard me," I replied. "The gate stays closed." Her smile disappeared almost immediately. She flipped through several pages before holding up what appeared to be violation notices. "The association has every right to inspect this property," she declared. "We have received multiple concerns regarding fence maintenance, vegetation, and unauthorized structures." I quietly glanced toward the faded red boundary marker standing several yards behind me beside the fence line. It had marked the exact property boundary for decades. Beyond it stretched acres of land my family had cared for since long before the subdivision behind those vehicles had ever existed. Neighbors began gathering at the end of the nearby road, watching from a respectful distance while pretending to walk their dogs or collect morning mail. Susan mistook my silence for uncertainty and took one confident step closer to the gate. "If you continue refusing entry," she said firmly, "we will have no choice but to involve law enforcement." I simply looked at the old brass key hanging from my belt, then back at her. She believed the gate represented the only barrier standing between her and my property. She had absolutely no idea that the strongest boundary protecting this land had never been built from wood. My name is Daniel Harper, and if you had driven past my property on any ordinary morning, you probably would have assumed I was just another landowner repairing an old fence before the summer heat settled in. I preferred it that way. My grandfather believed the best neighbors were the ones who never needed to remind anyone who they were. He bought this land decades before the first subdivision appeared on the opposite side of the county road. Long before decorative entrance signs, homeowners association meetings, or carefully landscaped streets existed, this pasture, the small lake, and every weathered fence post belonged to our family. Growing up here taught me that fences were never built to keep good people out. They simply marked where responsibility began. Every board I replaced, every gate hinge I repaired, and every tree I trimmed reminded me that ownership was not measured by paperwork alone. It was measured by years of care. That morning had started with the same quiet routine I followed every weekend. I checked the livestock fence running along the northern field, cleared fallen branches from the gravel driveway, inspected the shoreline after heavy spring rain, and made sure the faded red boundary marker remained standing exactly where the county surveyors placed it years earlier. The marker had become so familiar that I barely noticed it anymore. It simply belonged there, just like the old oak tree beside the entrance and the brass key hanging from my belt. Leaning against the side of my pickup truck was the weathered survey tube my father had carried during property inspections. Inside rested original county plats, recorded surveys, and the deed that had passed from one generation to the next. I rarely opened it because nothing about the boundaries had changed. The lines drawn on those maps had remained exactly where they were for decades. Standing at the closed gate, while Susan continued explaining why the homeowners association believed it deserved access to my land, I quietly looked beyond the vehicles parked outside the entrance. The subdivision behind them appeared peaceful enough. Children rode bicycles along quiet sidewalks, sprinklers watered carefully maintained lawns, and neighbors walked their dogs beneath rows of newly planted maple trees. I held no resentment toward the people living there. They had every right to enjoy their community. Their neighborhood simply ended where my property began. That distinction seemed obvious every time I looked across the fence, yet somehow it had become invisible to the group standing outside my gate. Susan opened another section of her yellow folder and began reading community regulations with complete confidence, occasionally pointing toward my pasture as though every acre beyond the entrance naturally belonged within her authority. Behind her, one homeowners association board member photographed the fence while another measured the width of the gate using a tape measure. Their confidence almost suggested they expected the property lines themselves to move if enough people believed the same story. I rested one hand on the weathered fence rail and listened without interruption. My father often reminded me that maps never become emotional, surveys never argue, and county records never rush. They simply wait for someone willing to read them carefully. And I had a feeling that morning would eventually require exactly that kind of patience. Susan Walker carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent years believing that every disagreement eventually ended in her favor. The yellow folder beneath her arm looked thick enough to contain an entire season of inspection reports, violation notices, highlighted regulations, and carefully organized correspondence. She turned another page, glanced toward the homeowners association board members standing behind her, and gave a small nod as though confirming that everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. One board member immediately began taking photographs of my entrance gate from several angles, while another stretched a tape measure across the width of the driveway, carefully writing numbers onto a clipboard. A third member pointed toward the weathered fence running beside the pasture and quietly discussed possible maintenance violations with Susan. None of them seemed interested in asking a simple question before beginning their inspection. They all behaved as though they had already crossed the most important boundary long before arriving at my property. I rested both hands on the top rail of the fence and listened without interrupting. The gentle breeze continued carrying the scent of fresh pine across the lake, while birds moved through the tall oak trees behind the house. Everything about the morning remained peaceful except the growing confidence gathering outside my gate. Susan raised another document from the yellow folder and explained that the homeowners association possessed the authority to verify compliance whenever visible concerns existed. She pointed towards sections of my pasture, the wooden fence, and a small storage barn standing beyond the field, as though each structure naturally fell beneath the association's jurisdiction. Her voice remained steady, polished, and completely certain. The homeowners association board members quietly agreed with every statement she made. They photographed fence posts, measured distances, and compared handwritten notes with printed community regulations. Their confidence almost made the situation appear reasonable until I remembered one very simple fact. Every measurement they carefully recorded stopped matching the exact moment someone opened the correct county map. Across the road, several neighbors gathered near the subdivision entrance pretending to organize gardening tools or retrieve morning newspapers while quietly watching the unusual scene unfold. Nobody crossed onto my property. Nobody attempted to open the gate. They simply watched with growing curiosity as the discussion continued. Susan finally closed the yellow folder and looked directly at me once again. "This inspection is not optional," she said firmly. "If you continue refusing reasonable access, we will request assistance from the sheriff's office." Her words hung quietly in the morning air. I looked toward the faded red boundary marker standing beside the fence line before glancing at the weathered survey tube leaning against my pickup truck. It had remained unopened throughout the entire conversation because there had not yet been any reason to reach for it. My grandfather often reminded me that the strongest evidence should never be rushed into an argument. It becomes far more valuable after everyone else has completely finished proving how certain they believe they are. I simply nodded once, folded my arms across the top of the gate, and calmly answered, "You should do whatever you believe is appropriate." Susan smiled with quiet satisfaction, convinced she had finally pushed the situation exactly where she wanted it. She reached for her phone, confident that official authority would soon unlock a gate that the law itself had already decided she could never legally cross. Less than 20 minutes after Susan made the call, the distant sound of approaching vehicles echoed along the county road before two sheriff's sport utility vehicles slowly turned onto the gravel entrance leading toward my gate. Dust drifted through the morning sunlight, while the flashing emergency lights reflected softly against the weathered fence. The Homeowners Association board members immediately straightened their posture, quietly gathering their clipboards and photographs, as though they had been waiting for this exact moment from the beginning. Susan closed her yellow folder with obvious satisfaction and stepped toward the entrance before the deputies had even finished parking. She greeted them confidently, introduced herself as the Homeowners Association president, and began explaining that I had refused to cooperate with a lawful property inspection. She described the fence, the pasture, and the buildings behind me while pointing toward different sections of the property, as if every acre naturally belonged beneath the authority of her association. The older deputy listened carefully without interrupting, occasionally making a brief note inside a small notebook while his partner slowly observed the surroundings. Neither deputy attempted to open the gate. Neither deputy crossed the fence line. They simply looked, listened, and allowed every person to explain their perspective before asking a single question. I appreciated that immediately. Professional people usually begin with observation before reaching conclusions. When Susan finished speaking, the older deputy turned toward me with a calm expression. "Good morning, sir. My name is Deputy Harris. Would you mind telling us what is happening from your point of view?" I rested one hand on the weathered gate and answered just as calmly as he had spoken. "Certainly. I own this property. I have politely declined permission for anyone to enter because I do not believe the Homeowners Association has legal authority over this land." Susan quickly stepped forward again before the deputy could respond. "That is exactly the problem," she insisted. "He continues refusing a routine inspection even after being informed of our regulations." Deputy Harris nodded politely before looking back toward me. "Do you have documentation supporting your understanding of the property boundaries?" The question did not surprise me. In fact, I had expected it from the moment I first heard the sheriff vehicles approaching. Good law enforcement officers understand that property disputes are settled with records rather than opinions. I glanced toward my pickup truck where the weathered survey tube still leaned against the passenger door exactly where I had left it earlier that morning. Nearby, the faded red boundary marker stood quietly beside the fence, almost unnoticed by everyone except me. The breeze continued moving through the tall grass while gentle ripples crossed the small lake behind the house. Everything around us felt remarkably peaceful despite the growing attention gathered outside the entrance. Several neighbors now watched from the edge of the county road, speaking quietly among themselves while waiting to see what would happen next. I looked back at Deputy Harris and gave a small respectful nod. "Yes, Deputy," I answered. "I have the original county records, the recorded survey, and every document establishing exactly where this property's legal boundaries begin and end. If you are willing to wait a moment, I will gladly bring them out." Susan smiled confidently, as though she believed no collection of papers could possibly change the outcome she had already imagined. She had no idea the answer to the entire morning had been waiting quietly inside that survey tube long before anyone ever arrived at my gate. Deputy Harris thanked me with a respectful nod and remained outside the gate while I walked back toward my pickup truck. I reached for the weathered survey tube resting against the passenger door, brushed away a thin layer of dust, and carried it to the tailgate before carefully removing the worn leather strap that had secured it for years. My father always stored important property records inside that tube because he believed the documents protecting the land deserved the same care as the land itself. I slowly removed several large rolled maps tied with faded cotton ribbon along with a neatly organized folder containing certified county records. The paper carried the familiar scent of old filing cabinets and preserved history. Every page had remained protected from sunlight, moisture, and time because my family understood that boundaries should never depend on memory alone. I walked back toward the gate carrying the survey tube beneath one arm and the county folder in my hand. Deputy Harris waited patiently while his partner observed the faded red boundary marker standing beside the fence line. Susan folded her arms with quiet confidence, clearly believing the records would simply repeat what she already expected to hear. I placed the folder on the flat wooden rail of the entrance gate and carefully spread the documents across the weathered boards. The first sheet contained the original recorded deed identifying every acre transferred to my grandfather decades earlier. Beneath it rested a professionally stamped county survey showing bearings, measurements, parcel numbers, and permanent boundary monuments. The next document displayed the official county plat map with neighboring parcels outlined in different colors. Finally, I unfolded the most recent tax assessment identifying the exact parcel boundaries recognized by the county assessor every single year. Deputy Harris examined each document slowly, comparing parcel numbers, survey references, and recording information before handing several pages to his partner. Neither deputy rushed through the process. They treated every document with careful attention because they understood that property records carried legal significance beyond personal opinions. Susan stepped slightly closer to the gate, attempting to read portions of the survey without crossing onto my property. One homeowners association board member quietly lifted a camera before lowering it again after realizing photographs would reveal nothing more than official public records. Another board member stopped writing entirely, choosing instead to watch the deputies review the paperwork in complete silence. The breeze gently lifted one corner of the county plat before Deputy Harris placed his hand over it to keep the map flat against the fence. His eyes followed one property line after another, occasionally comparing the survey with the tax map and then looking toward the surrounding landscape. The faded red boundary marker, the weathered fence, the gravel entrance, and the oak tree beside the gate all matched the survey with remarkable precision. I remained completely silent. There was nothing left for me to explain because the documents had already begun telling the story far better than words ever could. My grandfather often reminded me that once genuine evidence reaches the table, patience becomes more valuable than persuasion. Watching the deputies carefully compare every line on those maps, I realized that moment had finally arrived. Deputy Harris studied the county plat for several quiet moments before asking his partner to compare the parcel identification number with the digital county records available in the patrol vehicle. The younger deputy walked back to the sport utility vehicle, entered the parcel number exactly as it appeared on the recorded deed, and carefully reviewed the information displayed on the computer screen. Susan stood patiently beside the gate with her arms folded, still carrying the confidence that had followed her throughout the entire morning. She believed the documents might clarify ownership, but she remained convinced the homeowners association still possessed authority over the property itself. The younger deputy returned carrying a printed county parcel summary and handed it to Deputy Harris. Both men compared every page with the original survey spread across the weathered fence rail. Their eyes followed the bearings, boundary monuments, and recorded measurements before tracing the subdivision lines shown on the county plat. Finally, Deputy Harris looked toward the faded red boundary marker standing beside the entrance, then back toward the survey map resting beneath his hand. He slowly raised his eyes toward Susan and spoke with the calm professionalism that had never changed since arriving. "Ma'am, according to the recorded county survey, this property is located entirely outside the boundaries of your homeowners association." For just a moment, the breeze seemed louder than every person standing around the gate. Susan looked from the deputy to the map, then back toward me with an expression that no longer carried the certainty she had displayed earlier. "That cannot be correct," she replied quietly. "Every property along this road falls under our association." Deputy Harris gently turned the county plat toward her and pointed to the subdivision boundary drawn with a bold line. "Your association begins here," he explained, tracing the map with one finger before stopping several hundred feet away from my entrance. He then pointed toward the parcel outlined around my land. "Mr. Harper's property begins here. These are two separate legal areas recorded by the county. I allowed several seconds of silence to pass before speaking. My voice remained calm because there was no reason for it to be anything else. "Deputy," I said, "that is exactly why I declined permission to enter." Then I looked towards Susan and quietly added the single sentence that had been waiting since the beginning of the morning. "I am not even in your homeowners association." Nobody answered immediately. One homeowners association board member slowly lowered his clipboard until it rested against his side. Another quietly slipped a measuring tape back into its case without saying a word. The neighbors gathered near the county road exchanged surprised glances while continuing to watch in respectful silence. Deputy Harris carefully folded the county plat, placed it beside the recorded deed, and nodded once. "The documentation is clear," he said. "The recorded survey, county plat, deed, and parcel records all agree. This property does not fall under the jurisdiction of the homeowners association." Susan stared at the maps for several more moments as though hoping another page might produce a different answer. Instead, every document repeated exactly the same truth. The strongest boundary surrounding my land had never been the weathered fence, the locked gate, or the faded red marker. It had always been the line permanently recorded on a county map, patiently waiting for someone willing to read it. For several long moments, nobody standing outside the gate seemed interested in speaking. The morning breeze continued moving through the tall grass, while gentle ripples crossed the lake exactly as they had before the first sport utility vehicle arrived. Deputy Harris carefully gathered the county plat, the recorded survey, and the deed into one neat stack before looking towards Susan with the same respectful professionalism he had shown from the beginning. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "the county records establish that this property is outside the jurisdiction of your homeowners association. Because of that, the association does not have authority to require access or conduct inspections here." His words settled over the group with remarkable quiet. One homeowners association board member slowly lowered a clipboard until it rested against one leg. Another zipped a camera into its carrying case without taking another photograph. The member who had spent several minutes measuring the entrance gate quietly retracted the tape measure and slipped it into a toolbox without saying a single word. The activity that had filled the morning suddenly disappeared, replaced by thoughtful silence. Susan remained standing beside the entrance while looking back and forth between the weathered fence, the faded red boundary marker, and the county plat still resting on the gate. "We believe this parcel belonged inside the subdivision," she said softly. Deputy Harris nodded politely. "I understand, but public land records determine jurisdiction, not assumptions. The recorded survey clearly separates this parcel from the homeowners association." Nobody sounded angry. Nobody raised a voice. The entire conversation had become surprisingly calm now that every question had been answered by official documentation instead of opinions. Across the county road, several neighbors quietly returned to their morning routines. A man resumed walking his dog beneath the maple trees. Another neighbor collected a newspaper from the end of the driveway before glancing back one last time. The unusual gathering slowly began dissolving into an ordinary morning once again. Susan closed the yellow folder she had carried so confidently only an hour earlier. The highlighted regulations, printed notices, and inspection forms suddenly seemed much smaller beside the county records spread across the gate. She thanked the deputies for their time, then looked toward me with a more measured expression than the one she had worn when she first arrived. I simply nodded in return. There was nothing left to prove. Deputy Harris carefully handed every original document back to me exactly as he had received it. "Mr. Harper," he said, "these are exceptionally well organized. Keeping accurate property records prevents situations like this from becoming much more complicated." His comment reminded me of my father sitting at the kitchen table years earlier, carefully rolling survey maps back into the weathered tube after every inspection. He always said that land changes very slowly, but misunderstandings can appear overnight. That was why records mattered. They preserved facts long after memories became uncertain. I carefully returned the deed, county plat, and survey maps to the weathered survey tube, secured the worn leather strap around it, and leaned it once again against my pickup truck. The faded red boundary marker remained quietly beside the fence exactly where it had stood for decades. Nothing about the property had changed that morning. Only everyone's understanding of where the true boundary had always been. The deputies returned to their vehicles one by one, and within a few minutes the flashing emergency lights disappeared beyond the curve of the county road, leaving nothing behind except the familiar sounds of wind moving through the trees and water brushing against the shoreline. Susan and the remaining Homeowners Association board members gathered quietly near the entrance before walking back toward their sport utility vehicles. Nobody hurried. Nobody argued. The confidence that had carried them onto the property that morning had slowly been replaced by careful reflection. Before leaving, one board member paused beside the gate and looked toward the faded red boundary marker standing beyond the fence. "I never realized the subdivision ended there," he admitted quietly. I smiled politely. Most people never have a reason to study county plats until a question comes up. He nodded thoughtfully before climbing into the vehicle. Over the following several days, the story traveled through the surrounding community much faster than I expected. My mailbox remained surprisingly quiet, but my phone rang several times with neighbors asking where they could obtain copies of county parcel maps for their own properties. Some simply wanted to understand where their legal boundaries actually began. Others admitted they had always assumed the Homeowners Association covered more land than it truly did. I encouraged every person to visit the county recorder's office or use the public mapping system because official records always provided better answers than neighborhood rumors. A week later, I learned that the Homeowners Association Board had scheduled a meeting to review how future property questions would be handled. Rather than relying on assumptions based on appearance or location, they planned to verify parcel information through county records before issuing notices involving boundary concerns. That decision made perfect sense to me. Good procedures protect everyone, including the people responsible for enforcing them. I never considered the morning outside my gate a personal victory. It was simply a reminder that careful preparation often prevents unnecessary conflict. My father used to tell me that every hour spent organizing records could save days of disagreement later, and standing there with the weathered survey tube in my hands, I finally understood how right he had been. That old tube had quietly protected far more than paper. It had protected clarity. The faded red boundary marker remained exactly where county surveyors had placed it years earlier. The weathered fence still followed the same line across the pasture, and the old brass gate key continued hanging from my belt every morning while I repaired boards, cleared fallen branches, and cared for the land the same way my family always had. Nothing about the property needed to change because the truth had never changed. It had simply waited for the right moment to be unfolded across the top rail of an old wooden gate where everyone could finally see the same lines that had existed all along. Looking across the quiet pasture that afternoon, I realized boundaries are not created by opinions, meetings, or confidence. They are established through responsibility, preserved through accurate records, and respected when people choose facts over assumptions. Several weeks passed before I found myself standing at the old wooden gate again, just as the evening sun settled behind the hills beyond the lake. The air carried the familiar scent of cedar, fresh grass, and warm earth while a gentle breeze moved through the pasture exactly as it had on the morning everything changed. I slipped the old brass gate key into the lock, opened the entrance with the same quiet motion my grandfather had repeated thousands of times, and smiled as I listened to the familiar sound of the hinges swinging freely. Nothing about the land looked different. The weathered fence still stretched across the rolling fields. The faded red boundary marker remained firmly planted beside the fence line. The old oak tree continued casting its wide shadow across the gravel driveway, and the small lake reflected the golden colors of another peaceful sunset. I carried the weathered survey tube back into the workshop, where my father always stored it after every inspection. Before placing it on the shelf, I carefully removed the county plat, the recorded survey, and the original deed one final time. Each document still lay perfectly flat, every recorded line matching the land beyond the windows with remarkable precision. My grandfather used to say that maps were promises written on paper, promises that survived long after the people who first drew them were gone. As I rolled each document back into the survey tube, I realized he had been protecting much more than property. He had been preserving certainty for generations that would come after him. News from the nearby subdivision slowly became less about disagreement and more about improvement. Residents began attending homeowners association meetings with better questions and greater understanding of where community authority began and ended. Public county maps became part of routine discussions whenever boundary questions appeared. People who had once relied on assumptions started relying on official records instead. That small change quietly improved relationships throughout the area because everyone finally worked from the same facts. I occasionally saw Susan while driving along the county road. Whenever we crossed paths, we exchanged a polite wave before continuing in opposite directions. There was no reason to hold resentment. One difficult morning had taught all of us something valuable. Confidence becomes far more useful when it is supported by accurate information. Before locking the workshop, I looked once more across the pasture toward the weathered fence stretching into the distance. The strongest part of that fence had never been the cedar posts, the steel wire, or the heavy wooden gate. Its real strength came from the invisible line established decades earlier through careful surveys and faithfully preserved county records. Wood eventually weathers. Paint fades. Gates need repair. But the truth recorded with patience continues protecting honest people long after every board has been replaced. I slipped the old brass key back onto my belt, closed the workshop door, and watched the last light disappear beyond the hills while the quiet sounds of evening returned across the land my family had cared for through generations. Standing there beneath the fading sky, I understood one lesson more clearly than ever before. The strongest fence is never built from wood. It is built from responsibility, preserved by truth, and permanently protected by the lines that honest people choose to respect.